Монреальський саміт з питань міжнародної безпеки 11 і 12 жовтня цього року зібрав разом політиків, провідних експертів і журналістів Північної Америки та Європи для обговорення триваючої війни Росії в Україні. Тому що, як висловилися більшість промовців, геноцидне вторгнення Росії – це виклик глобальній безпеці, стабільності та правам людини. А відтак важливо визначити конкретні стратегії для допомоги Україні.
It is 595 days since Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 7 million people forced from their homes. But over the past few days, as I say, it's been hard also to look away from the events in Israel and Gaza Strip. Shocking imagery that certainly has striking similarities to the things that we have seen personally in Bucha, in Irpin.
Ukrainians are fighting and will continue fighting. Because what I was hearing from many of them, men and women, young, former journalists, doctors, IT, and different people who are now on the front line, everybody is telling, we need to win this war now so that our children need to fight one more time. And this is important to understand because this is what we Ukrainians feel.
So it's easy in a way for us to sit here and talk about what should the rest of the world be doing. But from your vantage point, in the constant conversations you have with the Ukraine government, I'm going to ask you the same question. What more do you want to see from NATO?
If we start with the NATO, there is one single thing what Ukrainians need from NATO. It's the membership. This is the straightforward, as we are talking about future security of Ukraine, because Russia still will be geographically our neighbor. There is only single way to guarantee the security of Ukraine is Ukraine's membership in NATO. And I really want to thank you, Canada, for the strong position among the NATO members to be supportive of Ukraine's future membership in NATO. And the declaration which Prime Minister signed with President Zelensky in June was one of the strongest in its wording. And this is, look, imagine the smaller countries who are not the NATO members. Will Putin stop only in Ukraine? No. We see that he's testing. And let's imagine that Putin was successful in his 3, 4, 7 days, whatever different intelligence services were expecting that Kyiv will fall. Russian soldiers would be on the border of NATO countries, which is a direct threat and security to all NATO as an alliance. And Canada is a member of the alliance.
Canada, I think, has a unique role to play in continuing to advocate for the protection of civilians. The narrative is win the war and civilians' lives will be lost. Yes, that's true. But in the course of trying to win that war, we have to be doing everything we can to protect civilians during that time period. Working on early warning, working on strategies that minimize civilian harm. And Canada can and should be a continued voice for prioritizing those particular issues. But I also think we have an important role to play in supporting civil society, Ukrainian civil society, the people who are going to be doing the hard work when all of us are gone to rebuild their society, to create the type of environment that allows for social cohesiveness in the midst and the aftermath of conflict, to advance the justice and accountability cause. And in thinking about that, there's something that we tend to always forget as we go back to 2014, that Putin tested out the permissibility of the international community through crimes perpetrated in Syria. And as we think about supporting civil society, I think there's a critical component that involves also supporting Syrian civil society in their efforts to document the crimes that continue to occur with the culpability, the involvement, the complicity, and the actual actions of the Russian government. And when we take our eye off of what is happening in Syria, we unfortunately are again, to our peril, harming people in Syria, in Ukraine, and around the world who face Russian crimes. And I think Canada can think about that and help weave those two together, provide the funding and support. But to do that, you need to do something that is sometimes really not so sexy. And that actually is focus on bureaucracy Make sure that you have the right individuals, the right offices teed up to have conversations about how to prioritize mass atrocity prevention and how to do that in a holistic way so we're not ad hoc scrambling to figure out what to do when a new crisis emerges, but actually have, like what the US has, an office for global criminal justice to be a leader in trying to think through how we can articulate and support calls for justice and accountability around the world and use Canada's expertise. Create an actual effective interagency system for coming together regularly to talk about threats of mass atrocities. We're the country who helped to build the UN system. John Humphrey helped create the kind of underpinnings of it. We came up with the concept of the responsibility to protect, and shepherded that. And we still don't have effective mechanisms in Ottawa to allow relevant people to speak to each other and make decisions about how to, in a timely way, save lives or anticipate risks. That is a problem. We seem to be unable to understand how interconnected, unfortunately, these apparatuses of hate, of evil are, and our failure to actually dedicate the resources to long-term prevention is, unfortunately, what requires General Leslie to say that we are going to have far higher costs, more lives lost, more political capital expended because we waited too long to respond. And it, again, is not sexy, but you've got to start upstream. You've got to think about prevention. And countries like Canada, I truly fundamentally believe, are uniquely placed to do that and have an obligation to do it.
The invasion of Ukraine has given NATO the collective bucket of ice water to the face that we need to evolve, we need to wake up, and we need to activate. Now, has that evolution, has this heightened vendor recognition been too little and too slow? Yes, but we have to see these things in terms of trajectories and not day-to-day headlines, day-to-day news cycles. The trajectory, I would say, shows that we are capable of change when faced with pressure. Now we need to strengthen on the institutional level and on a lot of logistical levels our military production, our procurement and supply to Ukraine, and above all, our political will to give Ukraine everything that they need to win this war. Imagine someone has fallen overboard in the sea in shark-infested waters. And we're in a cozy lifeboat, and we throw a life raft, or what do you call the round ones? A life preserver, to the guy in the water. Okay, so he's not going to drown. His head's above water. Thanks very much. However, what about these sharks that are still trying to eat me? Can you please reach out your hand and pull me into the boat? I would really love to get out of the shark-infested water. However, thank you for keeping my head above it. And that's the level of support we've given. I have spent time on the Eastern and Southern Front in the past year, and I can tell you the conditions under which the brave men and women of the Ukrainian armed forces are fighting, and the brave men and women of so many civil society groups, community groups, volunteer groups who are supporting the troops, also in the background with frontline deliveries and logistics and all kinds of mobilization. It's horrifying. Nothing is enough. We're talking about a war of attrition, World War II style artillery barrages, complete destruction. I've driven through villages where not a single wall remains standing. It's absolute destruction. It's like something out of a film about World War II.
The war in the Ukraine, we know, has exposed new forms of disinformation, shifting and evolving disinformation tactics, and it is truly shown unequivocally that the goal of disinformation is to cause harm, is to create confusion, is to sow division and cause chaos in public discourse, particularly in democratic areas. I don't think anyone on this panel would say that we can solve the problem of disinformation, but instead of playing an endless game of whack-a-mole, which is what a lot of us have been doing and have been seeing, we can consider themes and narratives and approaches to the issue, recognizing that global cross-platform and offline channels of disinformation means the problem does not stop at the border of Ukraine or Russia. So on that note, I'd like to begin with asking Marcus to just give a sense of some of the new narratives and tactics that are being seen by Russia right now in its propaganda war related to Ukraine.
Маркос Кольга, експерт із цифрових комунікацій, виділив два основні проросійські наративи щодо України: обвинувачення українців у нібито нацистських діях та звинувачення НАТО у нібито нелегальному постачанні зброї в Україну. І все це посилюється фейковими фото. Маркос також зазначив, що в Канаді також давно прослідковується проросійський шпіонаж.
My point and the point of this story is to demonstrate that this is not a new problem. We have simply, since the end of the Cold War, stopped paying attention. We thought it was the end of history. We thought the Russians were our allies, and we just stopped paying attention. But the Russians didn't. I mean, there was a period, I guess, in the 1990s where they were much busier stealing from the Russian state and engaging in corruption than in espionage. But certainly after Vladimir Putin took over in 2000, for the past 23 years now, they have been building up those capabilities again. And certainly in this country. And we know that. We know that the Russian embassy has actively cultivated this network. They offer individuals places on trade promotion organizations. Former diplomats have been given plum posts as directors of perhaps some Russian mining companies. They're also given senior positions on Russian think tanks, like the Valdai Club. This is an important one. Most Canadians don't realize that the Valdai Club is Vladimir Putin's personal think tank. And there are, in fact, a number of Canadians who have been involved with that organization, which is on our sanctions list. And most recently, at the last Valdai Club meeting, I think it was last weekend, there was actually a Canadian academic who was given the honor of asking a question about what happened here in Canada in Parliament a couple of weeks ago. And so these networks continue to be cultivated. And we know that the Russian embassy is also actively reaching out to journalists and academics to advance and amplify their narratives. Justin Ling, who I think is a Montreal-based journalist, an excellent Montreal-based investigative journalist, published a piece about 6 months ago outlining his experience with the Russian embassy in Canada, where I would call him an agent, apparently a diplomat. Kirill Kalinin was his name. He was thrown out of Canada in 2018 for his work in promoting Russian propaganda. Kirill had a story back in 2017, 2018, about our current Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, and her family, and possible connections to the Nazi occupying regime in Ukraine. Kirill Kalinin called all sorts of journalists, according to this article that Justin Ling published, called all sorts of journalists looking for someone to pick up this story. He was mostly unsuccessful, but we all know that that story would eventually emerge in our national media. And that was thanks to the efforts of these Russian propagandists who are working right here in the embassy in Ottawa. So it's a very important network. And I should also mention that, Russian propaganda on its own, when it's published by the Russian government, by the Kremlin, or on Russian state media, it's not effective on its own. So they rely on this network of enablers to legitimize it and cleanse it of its state origins, so that it does become effective in countries like Canada. And it is effective. This system is working. And indeed, we need to take steps in order to defend ourselves against it. And that's, one of these steps is what we were talking about in the spring, is a foreign influence registry. This might help limit or at least impose a cost for these individuals who want to collaborate and enable Russian disinformation and propaganda in this country.
I think the important thing, and that's what I try to do, and I encourage others to do the same thing, is to be critical when you read, to double-check the facts, and to react. To react, I try to address the main issues. I try to do that by appearing in forums such as this summit, I write articles in 5 languages, in Ukrainian, English, French, German, and Spanish, that get published in various newspapers and then are disseminated in social media. And I obviously, in my position as honorary consul of Ukraine in Montreal, have various meetings with government officials and with the diplomatic corps in Quebec, as well as appearing before the Parliamentary Committee on Issues Dealing with Ukraine. This is how I try to address these issues, and I encourage others to do the same and to disseminate good information that present accurately the facts regarding Ukraine. I think that one thing that we have all basically tried to convey is that at the end of the day, Russian disinformation does not have to convince you of another story. It basically has, like Gary Kasparov has said, annihilate the truth and to exhaust critical thinking. And the way you accomplish that is you throw in so much disinformation. You not only disinform about the issues, but you also target key players and you attack them and try to undermine them. So at the very end, in Canada, politicians, business people, media, and the average person says, you know what? I don't know who to believe anymore. And the next step normally is, at that point, I don't care anymore. And that is what disinformation at that level accomplishes. It enables, or it attempts to enable the Russians to ensure that Canada, on a long-term perspective, eventually comes to the conclusion that the situation in Ukraine is too complicated. We might as well leave it alone. We'll never be able to be helpful and might as well kind of address other issues.
Отже, дводенний захід, організований Монреальським інститутом досліджень геноциду та прав людини при університеті Конкордія в Монреалі, піднімав питання воєнних злочинів, пропаганди та дезінформації, китайсько-російської вісі та питання наслідків війни. Виконавчий директор Монреальського інституту досліджень геноциду Кайл Меттьюс вважає, що не можна просто спостерігати за злочинами росіян в Україні. Світ має реагувати.
Global issues as much as they should. Our government's not really thinking about this or telling Canadians about what's happening. And I think there's a need for us to look at what's happening in Ukraine. It's not just a Ukrainian issue. It's our NATO allies, it's European security, and it could really turn ugly in the Asia Pacific as well, as some people said today. So we need to think as a country. We have oceans between us, between Europe and between Asia. But that doesn't guarantee our security, so we have to get serious. And part of this is to show how brave the Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom, for their lives, for their culture. We should also help them and be strategic in how we behave as a country.
Це надзвичайна конференція. Тут дуже багато від всіляких народів, експертів, міжнародні експерти, котрі застановляються над справою, що діється з Україною, і як далі проводити цю боротьбу. Є різні теми дискусії, є дискусія, як захищати мілітарно кордони України, і такі другі теми про дезінформацію, і як захищати себе проти ті всі зусилля, що виходять від Москви.
Україні важливо, щоб звертали увагу на терміновість допомоги, яка Україні потрібна. Тому для України це постійна увага. Багато спікерів сьогодні і вчора говорили про те, що потрібно Україні швидко. Це зброя, щоб себе захистити, це високоточна зброя. Членство в НАТО – це наступний крок, але на даний час це потреба в допомозі, яка є швидкою. Дезінформація є складним запитанням, і важливо, щоб говорилося про освіту, як той інструмент, який існує в демократії, щоб боротися за правду.
I think you have to go back actually to Chechnya, the first destruction of Grozny. And what is now apparent is that I was there in the mid-1990s. We were all hoping that something maybe not called democracy, but something that would enable citizens to have a greater say in running the country would take hold. And obviously that did not happen. Now, what's happening now, I think, as was said, is partly the result of countries who have certain values who did not react. And we can start, I start with Rosemead, you could start certainly in 2008 with the seizure, I'll call it, of the two provinces of Georgia, and then of course Crimea, and now. And the direct point is that whatever happens there is of direct interest to Canada for several reasons. And one of them is because we have several diasporas in Canada. And we should be aware that we are vulnerable to the manipulation, the disinformation. And it creates tensions. It can create tensions in society. And we have a great country where people of different backgrounds can live. And we want to keep it that way.
У події загалом взяли участь більше 30 промовців, 6 інституцій-партнерів і близько 400 відвідувачів, щоб обговорити шляхи до перемоги і до такої системи, де немає місця злочинам, де права та гідність усіх людей захищаються і поважаються завжди.